Now your host for the Middle East Radio Forum, Meir Jolovitz.
Hi. Welcome, Middle East Radio Forum, the weekly program. This week, shall direct much of our attention to an examination of anti-Semitism as a political manifestation. We will compare and contrast the anti-Semitism from the left with that from the right. Today, we have the pleasure my pleasure, being host to an interview with Devin Sper. Devin has a distinguished resume as a respected authority in all matters that relate to Israeli affairs. As a political analyst, he's offered an uncompromising perspective that is founded in reality rather than on either political correctness or political expedience. Mr. Sper will examine the various aspects necessary to understanding and exposing anti-Semitism today. He'll do so indifferent to those who describe the world as it ought to be and present instead a picture of what it really is. Here's the quick intro of an otherwise long and impressive resume. Devin Sper was born and raised in New York, lived in Israel for 10 years, has a degree in Jewish history from the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. He served in the IDF, Israel Defense Forces. Since returning to the United States in 1982, Mr. Sper has spoken to numerous live radio and television audiences and has published numerous articles in defense of Israel. Devin Sper is the author of a blog on the Times of Israel and author of an award-winning book, The Future of Israel. Devin, it's long overdue, and it's a pleasure to have you join us today in studio.
Nice to meet you at last, Meir. We've heard about each other, I know, and
Yes.
We're on the same side, and pleasure to be here.
Okay, I hope the first of many. There's a lot to talk about, and as you and I have discussed before, there's very little time to do it, so we're going to cut to the chase. Let me begin with a very brief question. Democratic Party used to be the party of Daniel Patrick Moynihan. Today it's the party of Keith Ellison. Democratic Party used to be the party of Henry Scoop Jackson. Today it's the party of, well, too many anti-Israel voices. Would you comment, please?
There's always been anti-Semitism on the left and on the radical fringe, both on the right and the left, and on the fringe of the Democratic Party. What's changed is that, as we've seen happen earlier in Europe, it's infiltrated and threatens to become mainstream. And whereas Palestinian propaganda began on American universities, it's become now mainstream. We have two Congress people who we'll talk about who are basically open anti-Semites. And we have the leadership afraid to call them on it. And so you have this radical element which isn't quite in charge, but the people in charge are unwilling to deal with it.
Okay. Before we proceed, just for the audience, anti-Semitism of the American left, could I ask you to begin by defining anti-Semitism as you will describe it today to our listeners?
Anti-Semitism is, simply put, hatred and malice towards Jews. It has deep religious roots in both Christianity and Islam. But the anti-Semitism of today, the one we're going to be talking about today, is something different. It morphed in the modern era, particularly under Hitler, as I would call it, the religion of losers. The Germans, Hitler himself was an unemployed and failed artist. Göring was a heroin addict. Himmler was a sadistic chicken farmer, and they blamed their inadequacies and failure on the Jews, and then they convinced the German people that their failure and defeat in World War II was because of the Jews. Likewise, the Arabs blamed their inability to come into the modern world, their intolerant and chaotic societies, on the Jews rather than on their own failures. And in our society, individuals sometimes blame their own failure on the Jews. So anti-Semitism today has become the excuse by which every failed individual and community who doesn't want to take responsibility for their own lack of discipline, their own inadequacies, their own bad choices, they blame the Jews. It's the religion of losers.
Okay, well said. Let me just ask you this. I mean, traditionally, most people, I think, if you would ask them in the streets what anti-Semitism is, they would somehow identify it with the past and its right-wing manifestations, as you mentioned, Nazism, whatever. The reality is, behind the scenes, there was a lot of left-wing anti-Semitism actually at the same time. If you look at the 30s and the 40s and the 50s with the Soviet Union, the anti-Semitism there certainly came from the left. It's the one thing I think that the left and the right had in common is their hatred for Jews. Can you elaborate a little more, distinguishing one from the other?
We know what right-wing anti-Semitism is, but the difference, again, is that it's always been a lunatic fringe in the United States. It was at one time mainstream in Europe. For a brief period after the Holocaust, it became taboo. But it is again become mainstream under the guise of anti-Zionism. In the United States, it's never been mainstream on the right, and it has not in the past been mainstream on the left. There wasn't really a strong strain of anti-Semitism on the American left. But that has changed, and that's what we're going to talk about today.
Okay, good. Tragically, we're always governed by the clock. I'll mention this as we talk about the left and the right. When the left, the manifestation of the Soviet, for example, form of anti-Semitism, it's interesting that the intelligentsia in Europe, in the United States, George Bernard Shaw, for example, was a strong supporter of the Soviets, notwithstanding the reports that came in from the world telling us that the Soviets were, to a certain degree, just as bad as the Nazis, at least in a different way. When the doctors' trials happened, we're talking about 1953, the American intelligentsia, academia, was still supportive or apologetic about the left. Today, it seems to me, and I'm looking at the clock, we do have a minute and a half before I'm going to ask to go to break, but we look today, it seems that once again, the academic world is at the forefront of the anti-Israel element.
And that's because their real religion is, whatever religion there are, their real religion is liberalism. And that's true of the liberal Jews, and everything flows from that. And what's happened is people like Ikhlan Omar and Rashida Tlaib have brought the hatred, with which they were raised, and rather than them becoming civilized by emigrating to the United States and accepting civilized values, they are spreading their vile hatred into the mainstream, injecting it into the mainstream of the body politic. And so rather than becoming educated, seeing things in a more nuanced view, they have their simple, vicious, primitive anti-Semitism, which they are trying to inject into our debate.
Is it fair to say that it's not an accident that their political ideology, which is anti-Israel and anti-Jewish at its core, is well calculated? It isn't simply that they believe something which happens to be anti-Jewish.
I'm not sure what you mean by the question.
In other words, when they make comments denigrating Israel, when they make comments talking about, and I'll ask you when we come back from the break, their comments about AIPAC, about the support for whatever. They know what they're doing.
Absolutely.
Right.
Absolutely.
The darts that they throw have an intended target.
Yes, and it's the thin edge of the wedge. They want to inject this into the conversation until it becomes mainstream. First, they'll apologize or half apologize, and gradually anti-Semitism, as it has in Europe, simply becomes a mainstream phenomena.
Okay. All right. We have a minute and a half before we cut to break. There are a number of things we want to talk about. If you do have any questions of our guest today, Devin Sper, please feel free to call after the second break.
Now your host for the Middle East Radio Forum, Meir Jolovitz.
Hi, welcome back. Sitting in studio with me today is Devin Sper with his distinguished resume on Israeli and American Jewish affairs. Devin, let's continue. Let me just ask you this very simple question. Where do you see anti-Semitism becoming mainstream in the American left, and how did that happen?
Well, I'll give you a number of examples. You have the Women's March, which was a mass movement, right? This is not a few dozen Nazis in Charlottesville. This is a mass movement supported by the Democratic Party until recently, with major support all across the country and hundreds of thousands, perhaps millions of marches. Now, the leaders of the Women's March include Sarsour, who is a vicious anti-Israel, anti-Semite Palestinian. She said things like, quote, "Don't humanize Israelis."
Right.
And yet, the Obama administration called her a champion of change. So despite the anti-Semitism, they're being accepted and lauded on the Democratic left. You have Tamika Mallory. She's a person who's close to Farrakhan. She's called him the greatest of all time.
Unapologetically.
Right, and won't back down when she's interviewed. And then you have Farragut himself. So Farragut led the Million Man March. Again, this is not a fringe phenomena. That's Million Man March is a mainstream march, and he's a vicious anti-Semite. We're not talking about Israel. He hardly talks about Israel. He called the Jews, he compared them recently to termites. He's, called them Satan. He's a old-fashioned, vicious anti-Semite.
Spoke about Hitler being a great man.
Hitler was a great man, right? So this is the kind of vulgar anti-Semitism that we see on the radical left being accepted by the mainstream left.
Okay. This new left-wing anti-Semitic attitude that we see seems, and you mentioned a name or two, it seems to have infected Congress. Now, we have people who are running. It used to be, and I'll go back to previous elections, where there are certain people who ran as candidates who we insiders knew were not favorable to Jewish causes, weren't favorable to Israel, whatever, but they were careful to cloak that until they were in power. The people who are running today, and we're talking about these new faces, they're quite unabashed about their dislike of Israel. Could you comment about that?
And let me tell you why, first of all, before I go into what they've said. The reason is, in the previous campaign, you may have noticed that there was a debate between Hillary Clinton and Bernie Sanders. And Hillary Clinton defended Israel from the attacks on Gaza that were happening at the time. And the audience, the Democratic audience, gave her polite applause. Bernie Sanders countered that he opposed what Israel was doing and supported Hamas. And he got a standing ovation from the crowd. This is a Democratic crowd. Every Democratic candidate for president today has taken note of that reaction, and also the reaction at the Democratic National Convention when they tried to pass a pro-Israeli bill and couldn't get a voice vote to pass it. And that's where their base is. Their bases have been infected with this anti-Israel, anti-Semitism of the left, and politicians, of course, are always looking to the base. Another example of that is that you mentioned earlier that every one of the major Democratic declared presidential candidates, Cory Booker, Kamala Harris, Elizabeth Warren, and Bernie Sanders all stood to block an anti-BDS law, failed, but stood against that in Congress. And then we have now elected officials. We have Rashida Tlaib, Democrat of Michigan, and we have Ilhan Omar, a Democrat of Minnesota, who are anti-Israel and anti-Semitic. We've had Republican candidates who were Nazis in the past, but they didn't win. They didn't get any votes. These people won their district. So Ilhan Omar, for example, she has a map in her office that she put up showing the world, and she put a Post-it note over Israel and wrote on it, Palestine. Most recently, there was a controversy where she said that it's all about the Benjamins, implying that the reason people vote for Israel is money. And when she was asked, well, who's paying this money? She said AIPAC, which of course is not, does not pay money, but educates people.
Which we'll be speaking about also. Let me refer to one of them. We're on first name basis, Rashida Tlaib. It's interesting how she came out with the accusation that there was it was more than an inference. It was a direct accusation that American Jews are, in essence, there's a dual loyalty because of their support for Israel. And yet, at her victory celebration when she was elected, she was draped in a Palestinian flag, and they danced to Palestinian music. Now, it's interesting that she's allowed to have her political proclivity proclaimed out loud, but Jews aren't supposed to say that they support a strong and viable
Israel.
Israel.
They're accused of dual loyalty.
Dual loyalty. Right. That's right. That's right. Okay. Let me throw this in, talking about dual loyalty and everything else in American Jews, and what I think is a very tepid or timid view of Israeli affairs. I penned an op-ed one time in which I said that American Jews needed to learn from the African American community. The African American community is unafraid to take an issue, whatever that issue might be, and say, this is a black issue. This is what we are interested in. We support this particular aspect of that position. We do it unapologetically because it's in our best interest. Not so the Jews. The Jews are so afraid to make an issue appear to be a Jewish issue.
I want to support that with an example. I have many liberal Jewish friends, and I know many liberal Jews who acknowledge that Israel is not their first priority. And that's understandable. They have many other things before Israel, and that's acceptable as a democracy. But what I say to them is, can you imagine a black voter, whatever he is, liberal or conservative, voting for a white racist? Is a black voter going to vote for Lester Maddox or George Wallace or David Duke? That's not going to happen because he has self-respect.
Exactly right.
And yet you're telling me that you would vote for Barack Obama, who met with Farrakhan, for example, as a member of Congress, and who called Linda Sarsour champion of change and was terrible for Israel. So you would still vote for someone who is anti-Israel and even anti-Semitic because you have other issues that are more important to you.
Very well said. In fact, you just brought up an old name, Lester Maddox. Lester Maddox in the 1970s ran for lieutenant governor, deep south. And Lester Maddox it was scary, he got 72,000 votes. And you're right, Devin. I doubt that he got I don't think he got a dozen Jewish votes. And yet when you look at the people that we're speaking about today, they are in fact supported by the liberal leftist Jewish element. Linda Sarsour, in many organizations, J Street, is considered a champion, a hero.
Let me prove what you're saying in another way as well. People say, well, Ihlan Omar, she's an outlier. Yet she was appointed as a freshman congresswoman to the House Committee on Foreign Affairs. That's, first of all, rare for a freshman congresswoman. And what it tells you is that the leadership supports her, that the leadership, despite her long history of anti-Semitism, it didn't start with the latest tweet. She's a well-known anti-Semite. They support her and are promoting her. That contrasts with Steve King, for example, who made some you could interpret as racist comments and was immediately thrown off his committee assignments by the Republicans.
Right.
So it's not that even you have some cuckoo in Congress, it's that the leadership is tolerating it, and that's the danger.
Right. And it's interesting, you'd mentioned the four declared candidates and everything else. You mentioned Bernie Sanders. It's remarkable how these people, first of all, Bernie Sanders, to be used as an example, finds it convenient to be a Democrat only when he wants to be a Democrat. Otherwise, he's an independent. Bernie Sanders, in the same vein, finds it convenient to be Jewish only when it serves his purposes. And in this particular case, his declaration of being a Jew is only when he goes to bash Jews or bash Israel. And that's the reality, and it's a sad thing. And Jews, once again, as I mentioned a few minutes before, I think are much too tepid and much too timid in pointing that accusatory finger, a lesson that the blacks should teach the Jews because they are unafraid to do that. I'm looking at the clock. We have a hard break coming again. When we come back, we'll hit the next segment, next question, and I do see we have one call waiting to speak to our guest, so we'll take that perhaps when we come back. Middle East Radio Forum. Our guest today, Devin Sper, talking about anti-Semitism, its manifestation from the left as dangerous, if not more so, than that from the right today. Thank you.
Now your host for the Middle East Radio Forum, Meir Jolovitz.
Hi, welcome back, Middle East Radio Forum. Guest today in studio, Devin Sper. We have a call. Normally we get the calls a little later in the program. Let's take it now. The call from Hadar in Phoenix. Hadar?
Yes, good afternoon. First, I want to thank you both for doing a great job.
Thank you.
Second, have
Thank
a
you,
statement
Hadar.
and a question. Yes, I have a statement and a question. Fox News Sunday today, right now, with Chris Wallace, mentioned Donald Trump wall. Whenever I hear it, I have a problem. This is not a wall that belongs to Donald Trump. It belongs to the United States of America and the people that are giving the money to build it. So is there a way to let Fox News know, maybe you have connections, to let them know that this is a wrong way to state it? This is not Donald Trump wall. It's not around his house.
Okay.
Sorry.
No, not at all. Devin, did you want to take that?
Okay, well, I respect your opinion. I agree with your opinion, Hadar. It's not the subject we're discussing today. And I don't really have a connection to Fox News, and I'm not really in a position to change their view. But you could write to them, and any listener could write to them.
Okay.
Okay, thank you.
No, thank you. In fact, for the listeners out there, that lady behind that accent is the widow of Steve Carroll, our beloved Steve Carroll, who was the historian for this program for so many years. The question she asks is certainly a legitimate one, and I think implicit in the answer is the need to understand that if you think the media, even Fox, isn't going to throw these hard balls at Donald Trump, you've not been paying attention. But then again, it is what it is. We have an email that's coming from Sun City. It's Jan in Sun City. And she asks to elaborate on the nature of Islam as an influence for those two Congress people who were sworn in with the Quran. And the question, I think, asks, are they from the Muslim Brotherhood? Is it the Saudis? What, in fact, is their impetus in doing so? My answer is, and Devin, do you mind if I take it?
Oh, please.
My answer is, they happen to be good Muslims. That's right, they happen to be good Muslims. For 1,400 years, we've known exactly what Islam is by the reading of the Quran. They, the other side, and I applaud them for this, have been unapologetic in defending what they believe is the truth. And of course, the truth isn't always self-evident. Now, the reality is there's a clash in the Middle East. The war is not one of territories. It's one of ideology. It's a religious ideology. It's a religion. There is a clash between two mutually exclusive concepts. One is Islam, and the other is Zionism. Zionism is nothing more than the Jewish national liberation movement. It means that the Jews have a right to declare Israel or to recognize Israel as a Jewish state in the Middle East, something which is anathema to Islam. So if you're asking where they get the impetus from, the answer is, when you ask Muslim Brotherhood, yes. You ask the Quran, yes. You ask from the Saudis, yes. Whatever you might ask that's associated with Islam, is it from CARE? Yes. That is where they get the impetus. They look at the Quran and they are unapologetic about the fact that they defend it. And we, the Israelis, the Jews, the Westerners, are the infidels. That is the reality, Jan, in Sun City. Looking at the clock, we've got 2 minutes. We were talking about Ilhan Omar and her anti-Semitic tweet and everything else. How did the press, Devin, in the minute and a half that you have, how did the press deal with this issue?
Well, briefly, they ignored it, at least the mainstream press. They didn't call her out, as they never do Farrakhan or any of these other anti-Semites on the left. They're interested in calling out Nazis if they can somehow connect this to Trump, because that's their real issue. But they are not interested in actually calling out any anti-Semite on the left. It was only because on the right it was brought up and her tweets were so egregious that people were forced to deal with it. Then you have actual commentators like Mark Lamont of CNN, who was fired by CNN because he said somewhere, "Free Palestine from the river to the sea." This is a Palestinian slogan he was repeating. It isn't clear if he understands the meaning of it, but either way, either he's an ignoramus and a dupe, or he's an anti-Semite, because what that means is that all the Jews between the river and the sea have to be either expelled or exterminated. This is a genocidal statement, because there are 9 million people in Israel, 6 million of whom are Jews. He's also in the past defended terrorism against Israeli citizens, and there are many other commentators who are anti-Israel on CNN, on MSNBC, but in his case, and you're starting to see this morph into anti-Semitism as you do in this case.
Very good. His body of work, by the way, which is quite well known, and he was once also a commentator, a guest commentator on Fox, but his body of work is well known, and the comment that he made, from the river to the sea, which is a euphemism, as Devin mentioned, for the elimination of Israel, was not a mistake. He knows exactly what he was saying. Just one last thing, because we have a break that's coming up in 45 seconds. Just as a follow-up to what I had mentioned to Jan in Sun City about Islam, there's something that one needs to understand. It's a position that we've taken very strongly. They're against anything or everything that's not Islam. And this is Islam. This is Islam without adjectives. This isn't radical Islam. This isn't fundamentalist Islam. This isn't militant Islam. This is Islam. And we are, unfortunately, too afraid to say it. So I just said it now.
Now your host for the Middle East Radio Forum, Meir Jolovitz.
Hi, welcome back. Last segment, longest segment. Pleased to have in studio Devin Sper, expert on all things Israel and also on the American Jewish element. Devin, let's pick up where we left off. There's the issue of, often we hear the discussion of anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism, whatever. So let's begin with the fundamentals. Let's establish the most elementary fact. Zionism, as I mentioned, is the Jewish national liberation movement, period. At its core, it's the endeavor to separate, I should say the anti-Semite effort to separate the two. We're anti-Zionist but not anti-Semitic, I think is a ruse in order to be able to propagate their thing. Could you distinguish between anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism and how it affects us?
Well, I agree that it's a distinction without a difference. Anti-Semitism is hatred of the Jews, and anti-Zionism is hatred of the Jewish state. Anti-Semitism is a double standard towards the Jews, and anti-Zionism is a double standard towards the Jewish state. And make no mistake that it's because it's the Jewish state. So when, for example, Israel is singled out for annihilation because of some alleged imperfection in its democracy, this is a different standard than they're holding, say, Syria. There are people who say they're concerned with the welfare of Arabs, and they point to some alleged issue in Israel, although they have more rights and freedoms in Israel than in any Arab country. And they say, therefore, Israel has no right to exist and should be destroyed. And yet they don't say that about Syria or Yemen or Iraq or Libya, where the situation and the human rights situation for Arabs is much worse. So that's a double standard, and that's why there is real no difference between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. It's more fashionable today to call yourself an anti-Zionist. As I mentioned earlier, anti-Semitism since World War II is taboo. But anti-Zionism is all the rage in Europe, and it amounts to the same thing.
Okay. We were talking about Congress. We were talking about how Congress, how we have some voices there that are unafraid to speak their anti-Israel vitriol. And there's a fact. This element in Congress that does that happens to be represented. They're Democrat. They're part of the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party, if you look at the last number of elections, and in fact these stats are quite solid, the American Jewish community is quite strongly supportive of the American Democratic Party, to the tune of 71% in the last national election. In fact, in the midterm, 76% of the American Jews voted Democratic. With Hillary against Trump, it was 71%. With Obama, first term, 78%. Next term, 69%. There's a decided strength that they have, that they find in the American Jewish community, particularly in the amount of dollars that are raised. Now, this is the disturbing part. There have been studies that have been done, and they're not conclusive, but the studies show that an overwhelming amount of dollars that have been raised for the Democratic Party, which we have already identified as not being friendly to Israel, less so than ever before. Those dollars, the lowest estimate was 33 to 35%. The highest estimate actually had it above 70%. That 70% of the dollars raised by the Democratic Party are raised by American Jews, or I should say donated by American Jews. American Jews make up less than 1.9% of the American population. It's a trend that I find to be quite disturbing, and yet these people aren't afraid that they were going to lose their dollars coming from their constituents who are Jews. Would you comment about that?
They're not afraid because they're not going to lose those dollars, because their real religion is liberalism and not Judaism. And Judaism, where it coincides with liberalism, they're happy to point out, and where it doesn't, they're happy to ignore. So I hope that this issue of anti-Semitism that we're discussing, and it's the reason I'm discussing it today, I hope this will open some eyes and make them understand with whom they're in bed in the Democratic Party, and think again about what side they're on. And when they question that, maybe they'll question some of the other dogmas they believe in.
Okay, very good, Devin. Devin, we have a call. Do you mind if we take that call right now?
Please, always like calls.
We have Mark in Phoenix. Mark?
Yes, good afternoon.
Hi.
Good afternoon.
Dr. Goldberg, who used to probably got his degree in his PhD up in Michigan area, he should be there to educate the people, not that he wants to go there. The Jews in Michigan that voted for some of these people they voted for got hoodwinked by Takia, and they really kind of messed up, and they really didn't pay attention to what these Muslims were saying. So my question for you is, sir, when you have people that are Reform or Orthodox Jew, or let's say they're Messianic, I think they get the picture. But like you all been saying, the secular Jews really aren't Jewish at all, so they need to take that name. They're what you call Ginos, Jewish in name only. They need to sit around and take a good look at what they're doing in this country.
Okay, Mark, thank you for that. Devin, did you want to handle this?
To some extent, I agree with you in that I think Jews work against their own interests. I think sometimes they're the only people that will vote against their own interests because they place other interests above those things. And what I do and what I speak about and what I try to do is bring them over to their own side, which is the Jewish side, and to see Israel as their cause, and to see that as more important than saving the whales or any of the other things they think are important. That's my view. That's my mission. That's my goal.
Thank you, Devin. Allow me to expound also. It should be noted also that the people that we're speaking about, Tliab and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, or as someone said, occasionally Cortex, which perhaps is a better fitting name, whatever. They had the advantage also of running in a district where it was certain that they were going to win. Their constituents, it wasn't because of the Jewish vote or because of a Jewish indifference that they were able to win. They won because they were in the right districts, saying the right thing, and the numbers were on their side, which isn't to defend the Jews, because the Jews should have, even in defeat, should have been more vocal about the fact that they were running with this anti-Semitic posture.
Well, there were 45,000 Jews in that district, most of whom are Democrats. And
right.
I venture to say they voted for her.
Because they were Democrats, as I said, the 71 to 78%. That's exactly right. There was also a Pew poll that was done in 2012. The Pew poll, every year or two, they do significant pollings. The most significant, I think, there was a Pew poll which was done in 2012. It was quite sophisticated. The sample was between, I think, 53 and 5,400 people who were sampled, which is considered legitimate. And the question was asked of American Jews. They were given 10 issues, and they were asked, when choosing a presidential candidate, which is the most important issue. And the options were, there was health care, there was the economy, there was terrorism, there was, and so on and so forth. There were 10 categories. One of the categories was a stronger American-Israeli relations. In other words, the fate of Israel. And it's remarkable that when that question was asked, only 4.6% of the Jews asked said that that was the most important issue in choosing a presidential candidate. The same question was asked again and said, eliminating your first choice, which in most cases was either health care or the economy, what's the next important issue in your choosing a president? This is in 2012, mind you. And 4.4% said Israel. The question was asked again a third time, and that it jumped to 6.4%, which meant when given three options, which is the most important of these 10 issues for you, American Jews, in the totality of answering three questions, gave 15% support for Israel.
But I want to say again, that's their right. If they want to have other issues that concern them more, you and I have a different worldview, but that's their right. What I don't think is their right, what I don't accept, is that they are willing to support an anti-Semite because of where he stands on another issue and ignore his anti-Semitism. That they're willing to vote 80% for Barack Obama the second time, after it was known what an enemy of Israel he was.
68%. Right.
That they are willing to boycott the speech of the democratically elected Prime Minister of Israel in Congress.
That's exactly right.
To me, which is unforgivable, something they wouldn't do to any other head of state, including dictators like the head of Syria and Iran, where Kerry goes over and cozies up to them and treats them nicely and respectfully. But the democratically elected Prime Minister of Israel, they boycott. And all these Jews like Schumer in the Congress who say they're pro-Israel, that shows the hollowness of their position.
I would agree completely. In fact, Schumer was quite slow in ultimately opposing the Iran nuke deal and the $150 billion which was directed to them. He did that only when he knew that Obama had collected enough votes to pass it so he could save face with his constituents. When Trump became president and Trump said that he was going to abrogate or suspend the Iran nuke deal, it's interesting that Schumer, who claimed to oppose it, was vitriolic in his attack on Trump for wanting to abrogate the treaty.
We know why.
Yeah, of course we know why.
We all know why.
Okay, question about Democrats, about Jews and supporters. There's certain people who we know, billionaires. Let's name one, Sheldon Adelson, who strongly supports Israel, believes that Israel is on the right side of wrong in this particular case. He supports Israel, and it's condemned by, certainly if you turn to the liberal stations, MSNBC, CNN, if you read the New York Times, the Washington Post, LA Times, they all attack Sheldon Adelson for his support of conservative issues, but also of Israel. At the same time, you've got people like George Soros and Tom Steyer who take decidedly opposite views, give also millions and millions and millions of dollars, support that cause, and they're considered champions by the same element. Can you analyze it, or do I need a psychiatrist to sit in your stead to do this, Devin?
Well, because we know the answer is because the real religion is Judaism. That's the real value system. So if they can support that, they support it. And if someone is opposed to that, then they oppose him. Then they say he has no right to contribute. They say AIPAC has no right to be a lobby, and yet J Street does have the right to be a lobby. So they support lobbying only when it's favorable to them. It's a hypocritical point of view. Okay,
let's talk about a philosophical element. We always bring, when we talk about Israel on this program, we talk about American support, absent or present when it comes to supporting Israel on its issues. The Arab-Israeli conflict, as we have redefined or properly defined it in this show, is actually the Arab war against Israel, or even more accurately, if you want to bring in the Islamic Republic of Iran, it's the Muslim war against the Jews. With that as a backdrop, the American left, and it's true of the American Jewish left, liberal left, have basically embraced the Palestinian narrative when it comes to the discussion of the Middle East. The problem, the left agrees, taking the Arab line, is the problem isn't the refusal of the Arabs to recognize Israel's right to exist as a Jewish state, but rather of Jewish occupation. Now, that's a term that they use and I don't. It was Jewish liberation. A very simple question that's asked, and we ask this of the audience. The Arab narrative is based on the return of territories. The PLO was formed in 1964. Israel, in the 67 war, that's 3 years later, occupied, again their term, the territories. What was Israel... what were the Palestinians trying to liberate in 64 when Israel didn't occupy it chronologically until 3 years later?
Well, obviously they were trying to destroy Israel itself. And what's happened, actually, Mayor, is it's come full circle. There was a time where they were disingenuous about this, and they said, just give us back the territories and there'll be peace. Well, they didn't say that. We deluded ourselves. The left deluded itself. But that was the idea. And now that they've got those territories, because they've got Gaza and they've got the West Bank, now that mask has fallen, and they're showing their true nature, which is saying that we want to destroy Israel altogether. When Ihlan Omar says that she favors boycott, divestment, and sanctions, when Mark Lamont says from the river to the sea the Jews have to be expelled, he's not talking about the territories. They're talking about the whole of Israel.
Right. Devin, thank you for that. We've got a caller, Honey in Scottsdale. Honey, can we do this in 15 seconds, please?
Yes, I recently saw an interview on Fox with a Muslim woman. I did not catch her name, but she was passionate about Muslims supporting Israel and Judaism because much of their religion is based on it. So how do we answer people like that who believe in Islam, yet and they state, and she was passionate, are pro-Israel?
Thank you, Honey.
Well, I would encourage people like that. I think that people like that are what you want to see, and they are not the problem.
Okay. Looking at the clock, and it's not our friend. We've quickly reached the end of the show. I want to thank our guest today, Devin Sper. Your input and analysis is certainly quite important to understanding the issue. We trust that you'll join us again in the not-too-distant future.
It'll be my pleasure, and thank you for having me, Mayor.
Thank you. Regular listeners have come to expect an examination of Middle East affairs in a manner which we try to set the record straight. In the 19th century, Danish philosopher Kierkegaard once said, there are two ways to be fooled. One is to believe what isn't true, and the other is to refuse to accept what is true. Middle East Radio Forum, we understand that peace can only be gotten through strength and can never be gotten with people of ill will. Remember, as I always sign off, the only people mad at you for speaking the truth are those living a lie. Keep speaking the truth. This is Mayor Jolovitz wishing you a good week and signing off, reminding you that we'll be back next week, same time, same station. Be sure to listen in. Thank you.